Tactics and Practice podcast.
Dobar dan, everyone, and welcome to the Tactics and Practice podcast, the audio extension of Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art's discursive program of the same name, focusing on investigative art, society, and new technologies. This podcast series is part of the 15th edition of Tactics and Practice called Unreal Data, Real Effects. I am your host, Neja Berger, and I conducted a series of interesting conversations on this topic. In last week's episode, I talked to Felix Stalder about individuality/dividuality in relation to property, quantification, and the paranoid self. Today, I'm joined by Wendy Chun, Simon Fraser University's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media, Professor in the School of Communication, Director of the Digital Democracies Institute, PI of the Mellon-funded Data Fluencies Project, and author of numerous books, including New Media, Old Media, Updating to Remain the Same, and Discriminating Data. Thank you so much, Wendy, for joining us. In the previous episode that I just mentioned with Felix, we talked about how computation flattens the inherent ambiguity around us into one single reading. And Felix elaborated to an extent on some aspects of what he calls known unknowables of quantification. So the things we know are there, but the only thing we know about them is that they remain inherently unknowable. And one instance of this is data. It's never raw, always already cooked. Another instance is the knowledge the data does not create. So we can derive a number from a supposed measurement, the relation of which to whatever we would call real is already uncertain. And it will only measure this one precise aspect, not the whole. The more we zoom in, the more empty space there is between the dots we've measured. And the third instance of this known unknowable would be the machinery that creates the knowledge and the question about who constructs it and for which purpose. And you have really dug deep, philosophically, theoretically, interdisciplinary, also with your background in systems engineering, into the many ways a flattening of this ambiguity happens, how the machinery creates this knowledge, and how datafication abstracts from a complexity, a kind of normative regularity. And your research into both technical, historical, theoretical underpinnings of various steps of this process is extremely vast, but we'll get to touch upon some of that research today. For today, I thought we could go in depth into some foundational statistical methods like correlation and linear regression. These are all methods that tie 21st century big data and 20th century eugenics. You discern several problems here, that of a presumption of causality connected to proxies and latent categories, that of tying the past to the future, and that of perpetuating inequality. That's kind of what our conversation is going to be about, but I'd like to ask you to expand on some of these, and maybe we could start with the question of the proxy and the latent category.
So if we're thinking through that question of the known unknowable, it's really the proxy that sets that up. Mm-hmm. So a proxy is something that's measurable and knowable, that's supposed to represent or correlate with. By correlate means that it varies with this thing which you can't directly measure. So that would be the known unknowable. If you think about it in terms that are perhaps more friendly to everyone in terms of accepting the necessity of proxies, you can think through ice cores, or you can think through tree ring measurements as proxies for changes in global climate. We can't touch the climate that has happened before we were born or before human measurements have taken place, but we do know that there are certain things we can measure which will tell us and which correlate with global mean temperature. So that is an example of a proxy that's important to use. And I bring this up because there's sometimes a sense to say all proxies are bad. And what these proxies bring to the fore is that some proxies are necessary. And that if we think through not proxies themselves as good or bad, in the sense that all proxies are good or bad, but rather think through what the proxies are being used for and what's being said about these proxies, then I think we have a more nuanced conversation. So if you think through how correlation operates, which is the idea that one thing varies with another. So a classic example would be sort of a hand size varying with the length of your arms. That's one example that was actually used by eugenicists. The issue with correlation isn't necessarily that things are correlated or not, but rather the ways in which correlation, especially within the framework of the eugenicists who framed the term and used it, as well as 21st century big data people who celebrated correlation in the same way that eugenicists did, as a way to move away from questions of causation or theory to get to what really matters and how, in order to determine the future, or in order to read the future and the past. Then you get into some of the real problems that lay with the notion of correlation. So if you think through how Sir Francis Galton and how Karl Pearson, who were the early eugenicists, viewed correlation, it was a way for them to understand how heredity operated. And their view was that as biometricians, what they were interested in was measurements and statistics, because they thought Mendelian genetics was theoretical. So it was a widespread dismissal of Mendelian genetics as theory. And what they believed was that things that were correlated...
Sorry, can I interrupt you just for a little bit? Could you give us some more background on this biometricians versus Mendelians distinction?
Sure. So biometricians believe that traits were passed on generation to generation, but statistically. And they came up with what they called the law of heredity, which weighted certain generations by a certain amount. So your grandparents would count for an eighth of your height. Your parents would count for a quarter, etc. And they came up with this statistical relationship. Mendelians, on the other hand, of course, believe that genes were responsible for your height. And so you received genes from both your parents, and they combined and determined your height. So they were very different ways of understanding how heredity operated. And of course, there wasn't, especially when Mendelian genetics was first being taken up in the 20th century, there wasn't a lot of concrete mechanistic evidence. Instead, if you think through Mendel's experiments with the peas, it was like the wrinkled peas versus the smooth peas in order to figure out what was dominant and what was recessive. So those were two very different ways of understanding heredity. Of course, we now believe in Mendelian genetics. We believe that genes operate, although genetics has well been challenged in terms of understanding the importance of epigenetics as well as environment and how that affects things. So it's not as neat as was once imagined. But that was the debate. And so for the biometricians, who are also eugenicists, they believed what you had to do was figure out these traits that were passed on from generation to generation, and they viewed that these traits did not change. So what was important was to figure out through correlation what was passed on from generation to generation, and they believed anything that could be correlated and passed on was nature, and anything that wasn't passed on was nurture. So intelligence, alcoholism, criminality, these were all viewed as nature, and they could all be weighted in different ways to determine what the offspring would become. And that nurture didn't matter because it only affected one generation. So as they put it, education, leisure, good labor conditions were all a waste of money because they wouldn't affect offspring. So what's key there is that they viewed the future as being embedded within the past. And that's the problem with a lot of these current machine learning systems. And correlation is embedded to, and logistic regression, another thing that came from eugenicists, are all embedded within machine learning systems. But the idea is that you determine the future based on the past. So very concretely, in terms of machine learning systems, they're not only trained on past data, but they're verified as true if they repeat this past data. So certain forms of information or data are kept away from the training set, and they're considered the test set. And the idea is, can the program predict the test set, which is past data, either from the same training set or from another set altogether? And this is even true if you think of generative AI, because when generative AI started taking off and people were truly freaked out, it was when the results were quote unquote plausible. And things are plausible if they fit in within certain past patterns within certain standard deviations. And if you think through how LLMs, et cetera, work, they are still probability based.
Like you said, we're not saying here, of course, that models that use linear regression that have roots in eugenicist statistics are necessarily eugenicist in every use, or that proxies are inherently bad, as you pointed out. But this specific history does manifest in today's big data systems in certain ways, particularly in this pattern of reproduction of the past into the present and future. Could you give us some examples of how this happens and how it affects us?
Yes. So one thing we have to always keep in mind is that the past that are embedded in this model are not simply the past, they are deep fake versions of the past, right? So as you pointed out, the data is always selective, it's incomplete, et cetera, et cetera. So what seems to be, quote unquote, the past that's reproduced is always a deep fake version of it. And so this has implications for the future that is to be produced as well. I think that the implications of these are most clear in predictive policing systems, as well as risk assessment systems, because this, as was facial recognition systems. But if you think of something like predictive policing, there was this system that the Chicago police used called the heat list. And what they did was come up with a system which would produce 400 names of people most likely to kill or be killed. And so you'll notice that there's a conflation of those two categories together, which is itself problematic. They would then go visit these people and say, look, you need to change your ways or else you're going to end up dead. Now, there were many problems with this system, and it was also a bizarre attempt to automate this one system that did work, which is that you have previous offenders talk to people who are young and tell them about what life is like in prison and et cetera, and it affects people's behaviors. But that is different than having a police officer based on a risk score come and visit your home. Now, one problem with this system is that it was trained on data that was almost exclusively from African American communities, right? So who is going to come up as a risk except somebody who's African American? So that was clearly one problem that came up with this. The other thing was that they not only ranked 400 people, it turns out that they gave scores to, I'm trying to remember, I think it was at least 100,000 people or many thousands of people, and of which I think they put a little over 100,000 on the ranked as possibly to be either killed or killed. 92,000 of which I believe had never committed a crime whatsoever. And it turns out that the biggest factor was age at time of first arrest, as well as who somebody knew, right? So if you think through how the system works and what it's sampled on, what it'll reproduce is clearly problematic. And it's also problematic because by visiting these people who often had relatively clean rap sheets, they were drawing attention to these people and actually putting their lives in danger, because when the police came and visited their homes, other people thought they were snitches. And there was one case of this for Mr. McDaniel, and it turned out that he was probably put on the list because somebody whom he was arrested with when he was much younger for smoking dope, which is now, of course, legal, had been killed. So you see the logic going on here and the serious repercussions it has on people's lives. And it also, the heat list didn't end up bringing down the homicide rate, but what it did do was lead to people on the list being 2.88% times more likely to be arrested.
This may bring us to the point of how these models also actively construct reality and become self-fulfilling prophecies. Kathy O'Neill talks about these feedback loops. For example, a belief that bad credit score will mean bad job performance gets programmed into models used for hiring, and someone who has a bad credit score will be rejected when they apply for employment. And if they are jobless, they will be broke and their credit score will be even worse. And it'll be even less likely for them to find employment, and so on in a vicious cycle. And furthermore, there's the problem of there being no feedback for this model. In your example, I would assume if they just kept policing the same people in the same neighborhoods, the only feedback this model would receive is still from this group and keeps reaffirming the bias.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and in O'Neill's example I mentioned earlier, the employers would never get to know, oh, this person would actually be a good employee and feed this information back into the model, right? And this brings us back to your point about the problem of these models being trained and tested on past data. I wanted to bring this conversation back to something you said at the beginning of your previous answer. That's not even the past we're reproducing, but a deep fake version of the past. This historical perspective in connection to eugenics reminds me of my conversation last season with Jussi Parikka. He mentioned Galton as well, and also he made us all wonder about how do we know by way of mapping what is not known or what has been systematically excluded? And on top of that, not just what had been left out and excluded, but also if we imagine these, for lack of a better word, phenomena that were captured within certain mechanisms and turned into knowledge, what would have been, could have been, had they been mediated differently on a different scale within a different system of knowledge, maybe? So to your point about a deep fake version of the past, can we imagine, if it's even within our capacity living in this present, can we conceptualize, intervene, think about what versions of a different past might have existed and what that would imply?
I think what's absolutely key is historical research. Because if you go back to so-called founding examples of these concepts, what you uncover are different worlds, different understandings of social and different possibilities that are now on the map, but as white space. So they're on the map in the sense that they had to be deleted in order for these clear points to emerge. And I think one of the clearest examples of this is around the concept of homophily. So homophily is the idea that similarity breeds connection. And this has become the founding axiom of all recommender systems as well as social media networks. The idea is like attracts like. If you like this, you might like this. If you like this person, you might like that, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's important to understand about homophily is that it not only breeds segregation or echo chambers, that's the goal of homophily. Whether or not it reaches that is a different question. But not only does it seek segregation as a goal, it actually comes from studies of U.S. residential segregation, mid-20th century in public biracial housing projects. And the study looked at friendship patterns amongst biracial neighbors. And what it found, or how homophily was determined to exist, was the fact that white liberals over-select other white liberals as one of their three closest friends, and white illiberals over-select white illiberals as one of their three closest friends. Now, what's important to realize about this finding is that in order to show this, they erased all the responses of the Black residents, saying that Black residents did not have enough illiberal or ambivalent friends. But what's key there is that within their own categorization, never were the races together in terms of the category liberal or illiberal. So they got rid of all the Black residents. And they also got rid of the largest category of white residents, which were ambivalent. So you were considered to be liberal if you thought the housing project should be biracial and the races got along. You were illiberal if you thought the opposite, and you were ambivalent if you believed that the housing project should not be biracial, but the races got along. They got rid of that as well, because they argued that the ambivalence would have to at some point take a liberal or illiberal position. They also pointed out that the number of white illiberals over selecting other white liberals was also statistically not significant. It was a difference of 3 people. So if you look at that, and what's important, if you go to the archive and go to the project, what they also show is that there were quite a few friendships between Black and white neighbors as well as acquaintances, and that there were reasons why the Black neighbors believed that the project should be biracial, and that was the fact that they were finally getting decent housing at the same price as white residents. And there's a long history of how Black Americans were refused decent housing, forced into slums, and forced to pay extraordinary amounts for substandard housing. So this is all erased when you suddenly just come up with these neat lines of homophily. And so within every line or point, there is an entire space around it that makes possible the connection. And so what I believe you need to do is look at a network not from the point of view of the line, but from the space around the line, and try to think through what is in that space. Now, any historical research, as everyone has pointed out, is not going to give you the quote-unquote uncomplicated ground truth. You can think of Saidiya Hartman's work around the importance of fabulation to understand the lives of Black Americans during the time of slavery, because the archives that do exist are simply numbers. You can also think through the way Ariella Azulay talks about potential history and the ways in which we need to read potential relations that are embedded within photographs. So this is always a creative endeavor.
You mentioned these alternatives or creative imaginations. I want to ask here, for example, about heterophilia. Not sure how it's called. You mentioned in discriminating data that in this original sociological study on segregation, where the term homophily comes from, in this sense, they talked about heterophilia as well. So how does it relate to all this? Why did homophily become so axiomatic?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that they do coin the terms heterophilia and homophily, but they only come up with a sort of mathematical analysis of homophily. And their notion of heterophilia is not exactly positive. It's done in terms of the self-hating Jew, for instance. So why one is attracted to the opposite. I think that what's important is that homophily sort of really, if you do an analysis of when and how it gets taken up again, it's again with the computational social sciences and the rise of recommender systems. Because homophily is an easier thing to measure. And it does explain some friendship formation. It's not as though similarity doesn't breed a connection at times. It's just that it only presents a small portion of it. And by amplifying homophily only, what you get are extremely angry clusters of similarity, because similarity also repels. And what brings people together and holds them together, even if you think through the primal example of homophily, it's racism. So it's not an accident that homophily and attitudes towards racism have been linked together. Now, what's key for me is less modeling heterophilia, although this is clearly something that corporations are interested in as well, because opposites do attract. And if you want to expand your market and branch out, focusing on homophily is going to narrow your market rather than expand it in the way you'd like. For us, what's more important and what we've been trying to think through is indifference. So how to live in difference. And here, I think if we go back to the example of the network, it's those white spaces, right? So it's the white spaces that enable connection to emerge. And by thinking through indifference, you think through the infrastructures without which there would be no society. So the example I often give is everything you need to forget or not care about in order to ride public transportation. And that is also a moment of caring. It's a moment of caring for the environment. It's the moment of caring for my neighbors, to keep public transportation thriving, etc. And so for us, we're trying to think through and trying to model what the importance of indifference is.
Maybe, can you give me maybe just one more example of what that would mean? How we could practice that, if that's even...
Again, I think public infrastructures are a key and vibrant example of living in difference. I think that if we think through historical examples, again, if we go back to the testimony of the Black residents, because they were interviewed as well, there's a great interview with this one woman, and she said, quite plainly, it's not that, white people are welcome here as well, but I'm not going to go out of my way to be friendly towards them or unfriendly towards them. It's that we all have decent housing, and that's what's important. So to move it away from highly affectively charged terms and to move away from everything being a friend, right? So if you think what homophily does is it perverts neighbors into friends, right? Neighbors were always supposed to be somewhat difficult. As neighbor comes from the term bor, and instead portrays this vision of the world in which you should only be with people who are like you and who are your, as you see in the example of homophily, 3 closest friends. So what indifference enables us to do is actually to think through the indifference of neighbors that makes possible care. Now, indifference has its problems. We're not talking about just simply not caring about people, but living in difference. And living in difference requires that we care for people differently.
You mentioned affects, effectiveness within this clustering, and thus you write about a sort of magnetic polarization. And this is a good point, I think, to move to the last set of questions on your concept of algorithmic authenticity. So if we connected first to this question of polarization, of clustering, clusters that are effectively charged, we come to this red-pilled version of authenticity, as in I'm going against the system to find my authentic self and the authentic truth. Being red-pilled here would match the reductionist kind of view on ideology as false consciousness, as if taking the red pill will lead us toward a path to the real underneath. And you argue in your works how this narrative of going against the system that's manipulating the masses and being authentic has actually become normative, even algorithmic in itself.
Yes. So what's fascinating to me is not simply that authenticity is now algorithmic, but authenticity has to some extent always been algorithmic. So if you view authenticity as responding to the command to thine own self be true, then it is the following of a certain algorithmic structure. And what's fascinating to me now is that, of course, you have all these primers, how to be authentic leadership, step-by-step manuals for you to follow in order to be an authentic influencer, et cetera, where your authenticity is considered to be your brand. So this has become blatantly algorithmic. And what I'm interested in is less that, so therefore this is fake, but more in terms of, given that authenticity has always been, to some extent, algorithmic, what is unique and important about this moment. And as many people pointed out, what's important is that authenticity, which always presumes a kind of transparency between your outside and inside, that you're not hiding something. That's how you show you're authentic, has been linked to certain forms of transgression or certain kinds of open secrets, right? So if you think through what authenticity does in terms of making you transparent, it does make your secrets open. So a marker of you being authentic is often revealing something everybody already knows about you, an open secret, and then creating a cluster amongst people who share the same open secret. And that's that move towards clustering. And why authenticity, which is the algorithmically in terms of recommender systems, et cetera, finding some vague transgression or something that makes people affectively charged, whether it makes them laugh, cry, angry, why those are so effective in terms of creating these, what I call these agitated clusters of comforting rage.
That's a very good expression, agitated clusters of comforting rage. When we talk about these things, we often think about echo chambers online and about so-called fake news. So how does this concept, algorithmic authenticity and all of its dimensions, relate to a concept of truth or also to a concept of fact?
So for us, what's important about authenticity is that it calls into question a lot of the ways in which mis or disinformation is being framed. A lot of the work has been framed around fact-checking. And fact-checking is important. This is absolutely important, but it's clearly not enough because people spread information when they're not paying attention, or they spread information that they find to be funny or that speaks to them in certain ways. You can also think about the ways in which people watch films or read novels and feel that these are absolutely true, even though they're fictional. And another example that I often give is that the 2016 US presidential elections were both called the fake news elections and the authenticity elections, and the person who won scored high on both. So by thinking through authenticity, it allows us to understand why and how certain forms of information circulate and are attractive outside of the question of are they correct or incorrect.
And outside of correct, incorrect, can I ask you to expand a bit more what that might encompass, verifying outside of just fact-checking?
So one project that we have been doing here called Beyond Verification looks at the ways in which we can study news stories and other stories and rank them and try to understand how they deploy modes of authenticity as opposed to fact-checking them, in order to understand how authenticity is used in order to construct certain types of news stories. And why that's important to think about. And the example that we've been thinking through is anti-Asian hate during COVID-19. So as you know, there was a spike of anti-Asian hate, especially within places like Vancouver, which is where I live in Canada. And why we use the rubric of authenticity to think through this is that within the framework of North America, Asian Americans are often framed as inauthentic, that they're never authentically Canadian or authentically American. So one example I often give is, I don't know how many of you are figure skating fans, but when Michelle Kwan was defeated, one headline read, "American defeats Kwan." And Michelle Kwan is American.
Right.
And there's been a lot of work within Asian American studies in terms of how the Asian-American is always this, is not a hyphen, it's this slash. And this is very different than considering, for example, people from German heritage or Irish heritage who have become Canadian or American. That there's never that view of them as quote unquote inauthentic.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've been doing is using this rubric of authenticity. And this is work being led by Prem Sylvester and Sage Hughes. We've just wrote up this article to try to understand how authenticity is not only in terms of justifying certain types of news stories, but also in representing certain racial groups. And then the idea is not to say, therefore, we need to have more, quote unquote, authentic representations, but actually think through and examine the work that authenticity is doing.
That's so interesting. Speaking of examining the work authenticity is doing, for my last question, I just like us to touch upon another aspect of authenticity or authentication that was mentioned in a recent book you co-authored called Algorithmic Authenticity. When we talk about forms of authentication, like passwords, which include a performance of knowing a secret as a proxy for individual identity, or verifying one's identity through a third-party platform, or digital signatures, for example, where a set of rules and criteria must be fulfilled in order to be authenticated. All these systems match past and present observed experience or match present instances to a framework of authentication, a pre-established pattern. And you say that these types of authentication are reflective of hegemonic ideals of authenticity, but that there are also queer modes of authentication. And I'd really love to know, for the end, how can we think of them? How can we queer these modes of authentication?
Yeah, so that, thank you for mentioning that book. And so that was a co-authored book, and the lead author was Anthony Burton. And he was very much trying to think through, and we were trying to bring together modes of technical authentication as well as cultural authentication to see where they coincided and where they didn't. And so authentication presumes, of course, that nothing changes, right? That your password remains the same, that you're able to give it, that that's a stable marker of identity. And if I could give you a interesting example of querying authentication or ways to think through this, there's of course the scam, right? Mm-hmm. So the scammer is always trying to get you to reveal your password or etc., is always trying to appear authentic and is doing this in such a way to get you to reveal certain forms of information. And the scammer can only work because there is this rigid sense of, there is this thing which is consistent across things. Now, when we were trying to think through, and here I was earlier trying to think through what queering homophily would look like, because queer theory gives us a different way to think through what appears to be bad copies or relationships that complicate the rigid reproduction of the same. And here I'm thinking through Judith Butler's notion of the bad copy. I think that thinking through bad copies in terms of both scams as being copies that are trying to appear good but then ourselves bad is one framework that complicates some of the assertions simply about copying. Although what's important about that kind of scam copy is that it tries to be the perfect copy, which is different than queer theory, which calls on us to think through the potency of the copy that always fails, that always gives you the sense that something else is possible. And here, in terms of technical authentication, it would be less in terms of thinking about failures to reproduce perfectly as an anomaly, but rather thinking about that as the norm. So if you think through how signals operate, just very basically in terms of hardware, they're always degrading. They always lose their shape. This is why you have repeaters, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that thinking through this actually gets you more to the physicality of these machines and makes you query everything that needs to be in place in order for this seemingly default world of reproducibility to emerge.
The default world of reproducibility, so quotable. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your knowledge with us today, Wendy. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And that's it for today. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Unreal Data, Real Effects is a series of podcasts conceived and conducted by myself, Neja Berger, for the 15th edition of Tactics in Practice, the discursive program of the Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art, curated this year by Mediengruppe Bitnik in collaboration with Janez Fakin Janša. For more information on the context, participants, and partners involved, see the links in the description. This episode was recorded and edited by me. The music and audio post-production were taken care of by Gašper Torkar, and the project coordination by Marcela Okretič. You're welcome to visit aksioma.org, where you'll find a wealth of free content. And if you like what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon or by making a donation. Next week, I'll be joined by artist, writer, and responsible AI researcher Eric Salvaggio to discuss methodologies for investigating training data behind the models. But that's it for today. Greetings from Ljubljana and na svidenje.
Tactics and Practice Podcast.